Welcome back to AP US History. We're continuing to talk about the 20s. We're going to be talking about the politics of the 20s and leading up to the Great Depression. The Great Depression we'll talk about in chapter 24. Um, in terms of the politics of this era, Americans really just wanted to be left alone after World War I. We didn't want to be a superpower. We wanted to go back to being an isolated country, isolationism, and take care of our own business and stay out of other people's business. And this is a policy that we had instituted since George Washington. Now, the election of 1920, Wilson is done in terms of his 8 years, and we have a felon by the name of Warren G. Harding become president. He was nominated. He was from Ohio. Um, he was a little unclear on some of his issues. He certainly was pro-business. He was not a reformer. The progressive period from 1900 to 1920 is pretty much over. He spoke of normalcy, that is, again, going to isolationism. Let's do it like we did it before World War One. And Americans agreed with him. Some Americans were disappointed that we were in the war, didn't think there were any compelling reasons to do it, but we somehow got sucked into the war. Many Americans were tired of the idealism of the progressive period, and they wanted to turn their attentions on making money and taking care of their families. In terms of this American isolationism, Henry Cabot Lodge from Maine certainly was a big proponent of this. He refused, along with some other Republican senators, to sign the Versailles Treaty, which created the League of Nations. He said that if we were to sign this, that we would surrender some of our sovereignty as Americans, and he's going to reject it. And of course, Wilson is disappointed that this doesn't happen. He goes on a personal campaign to try to persuade the Americans to sign the Treaty of Versailles, and essentially ruins his health. But we never do sign this treaty. But in 1921, Congress will pass a joint resolution saying the war is officially over. Now, these conservatives, considered the old guard of the Republican Party, aren't too interested in anything that Teddy Roosevelt was pushing in 1912. The Democrats will nominate a fellow by the name of James Cox. He supported the League of Nations. He reported that he was still would push for the socialist agenda or the progressive agenda, look for reforms. Harding wins in a landslide. People are just sick and tired of being involved overseas and also in reform. Eugene Debs received almost 1 million votes while he was in jail. Here's a picture of Warren Harding. Nothing really remarkable about the man. Was a man of few words. Unfortunately for him, like Grant, surrounded himself with some crooked people. Some of the things that had been done, the expansion of the government during World War I is going to shrink. The War Industry Board is dismantled. Some people were hoping that the government would take over certain businesses, but they didn't. The Cummings Transportation Act of 1920 returned the railroads to their owners, and the Interstate Commerce Commission guaranteed that railroads would make a profit. Of course, a lot of farmers were disappointed because they wanted the railroads to be owned by the government. There were riots, Chicago riot 1919, people a little bit unhappy with the way they were treated. This is a race riot there. Many of the blacks returning from the war felt that they were being discriminated. They felt that if they bled on the battlefield, they should have the same rights as whites in America. Many of the blacks who had migrated to the north will not return and stay in the big cities in the north and work there. Um, this riot in 1919, 23 blacks were killed, 15 whites. About 500 wounded, and about 1,000 families lost their homes because they were burned to the ground. Certainly, there were other riots in America about this time in Knoxville, Ohio, Washington. There was looting and rioting, people just enfranchised by the way the system worked. The Red Scare hits America in the 1919 after World War One. It seemed like the radicals were taking over the unions, threatening the capitalism. We didn't want to become like the Bolsheviks in Russia. Harding's administration was pretty much a do-nothing administration in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. Um, Although the Palmer raids will be sanctioned to get clean up and remove the Red Menace. Certainly, there were scandals in Harding's administration. If he had lived throughout his whole term, he may have been impeached for misconduct, perhaps. I don't know that they could have proved that he was part of all the schemes, but certainly he was made poor decisions in choosing people to be part of his cabinet. But many of his prominent friends were brought onto the cabinet, and they're going to make some corrupt bargains to line their own pockets. One of the first exposed is Colonel Charles Forbes. He was head of the Veterans Bureau. He and others looted about $200 million from the agency while building hospitals. So they were getting kickbacks from contractors building the hospitals for the returning veterans. He was sentenced to 2 years for his crime. But I suppose if you're talking about millions of dollars, maybe that wasn't so much to spend. The Teapot Dome scandal in 1921. Probably one of the worst scandals in American history. Albert Fall, who was the Secretary of Interior, arranged for a couple of oil tycoons to buy oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. Now, these oil reserves are supposed to be for the Navy. Harding signed the transfer in secret. And Albert Fall then leased the reserves to two oilmen and took a bribe for $400,000. This shows Albert's Beacon Fall and the scandal. The investigation found him guilty of conspiracy and bribery. This really taints the Harding administration. The scandal became public in 1923. 3 men indicted in 24. But the case was never really resolved until 1929. Again, one of his cabinet members was sentenced to 1 year in jail. Maybe not such a bad wage for that time. It's quite a bit of money to spend 1 day in jail. The oil men were acquitted of the bribes. They couldn't prove it. And it again undermined the faith of most Americans in our government. Dougherty was accused of selling pardons and helping bootleggers. He was the Attorney General. Because of his misconduct, was forced to resign in 1927. So it was alleged he got kickbacks, and in the face of all this, he never went to trial, but left the office in disgrace. Well, I guess it did go to the trial, I'm sorry, but he was never convicted. Several of his advisors committed suicide rather than face the charges that he was faced with. Unfortunately for Harding, or fortunately, I don't know how this works for America, Harding died in San Francisco, and Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, will assume the office of president. and he will have the same attitude that Harding had towards big business and the progressive agenda. He was against that. He was an honest man, I suspect, or it seemed that way, and scandal will not plague his administration. Harding agenda was essentially carried out by Coolidge and Hoover. These are two more Republican presidents. Of course, the government was not supposed to be interfering with business. They wanted business to be profitable. They did believe in tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy. Sounds a little bit like presidents in the 20th century. Andrew Mellon engineered several tax cuts for the wealthy. The burden of taxation shifts to the middle class and the lower class. Higher tariffs to protect American business. Again, Republicans seem to be enamored with tariffs, which forces up the prices of goods being imported from other countries. Unfortunately, as we raise a tariff, other countries raise their tariff, so it makes it much more difficult for our business and farmers to sell overseas. Certainly a friend of big business. If government was doing well, it was because the business community was doing well. Businessmen were thought of almost as gods. In terms of World War I and the debt, the economy will take a dip, but then it will recover. It seems as though nothing is going to stop this economy. Of course, farmers never fully recovered from the World War I. They were still overproducing. Their income was going down. Government did very little to help them. The Europeans will have trouble paying their debts back, but Coolidge will insist that they pay every dime of it back. Europeans will retaliate and raise higher tariffs on American businesses, goods, and again, the government was to stay out of business affairs, laissez-faire, so less government regulations. Corporations are going to grow, and mergers are going to happen during this time, and more monopolies are going to be created. Antitrust laws are ignored by the Attorney General. Industrialists set up trade associations to set prices for advertisement products and so forth. Consumers suffered as a result of this lax behavior on the government's part, and as consumers almost always do when there is no regulation. Most of the cabinet positions were filled by wealthy businessmen. The federal government was not in the business of providing money to people, and so they did not believe in welfare. They only believed in the work ethic. And we'll stop right there and pick this up next time.